In this lesson, we'll put photosynthesis into an evolutionary context as well as situate it in our galaxy. Here we see a photograph taken in the Grand Tetons in Wyoming, and we have the Milky Way in the dark sky. Now, when we look to the core of the Milky Way, we're looking from a position approximately here. If this were the Milky Way galaxy, our solar system would be about here, and when we look in the night sky and see the core of the Milky Way, we're looking in this direction there. We have learned that our solar system consists of a star, our sun, and we have orbiting planets, some of which are rocky planets, others are gas planets. We've also learned that when rocky planets are within a range of orbital distances, they can have liquid water on their surface. We call that the habitable zone. And by studying living things on Earth, we see that living things on Earth require liquid water. Much of the chemistry that goes on inside living cells occurs in a fluid medium, and that is water. And so in the history of life on Earth, then, we start with a planet with no living things, a lifeless rock, and today we have a planet covered with millions of different kinds of species. Of course, the key transition in the history of life on Earth was the origin of the first cells. These cells went on over the course of 4 billion years to evolve into the millions of different species we see today. What we've been studying is the process of photosynthesis, and a notable type of organism that performs photosynthesis would be plants. And so we've been studying plants and what they need to do this photosynthesis reaction. But if we situate plants on the tree of life, and here we see a diagram representing many of the different species that live on Earth today and how they are related by common ancestry. If we situate plants on a diagram like this, here they are over here. Green, due to the fact that plants are green, and it's in the green structures where photosynthesis occurs. So plants are multi-celled organisms that perform photosynthesis. They can make their own food using simple materials in their environment, water and carbon dioxide. And the energy to power that chemistry is captured from sunlight. Inside plant cells, we see these green discs. These are the chloroplasts. This is where photosynthesis occurs. But plants did not invent photosynthesis. In fact, there are simpler organisms, single-celled organisms, that also do photosynthesis, such as Euglena. Here we see a single-celled organism. It appears green. It's jam-packed with chloroplasts. It has this red spot here called an eye spot that can detect light, which is handy. And in addition, it has a flagellum here, which allows it to swim through water. So these things live in ponds and streams all over the world. So effectively, these organisms can swim to the light. They can stay in areas where there's light so as to capture that light and perform photosynthesis. If we put Euglena on the tree of life, they pre-existed plants. So these were single-celled organisms, whereas plants are multi-celled. So multi-celled plants had single-celled ancestors that were already doing photosynthesis. But photosynthesis didn't start with these types of organisms either. In fact, photosynthesis has a long history. Photosynthesis was invented by bacteria. Here we see cyanobacteria today. These kinds of organisms have been on Earth for over 3.5 billion years. And again, situating them on the tree of life, we're all the way back down very close to the bottom of the tree, to the root of the tree, to the origin of life. So if we peg the origin of life something like 4 billion years ago or so, already within 500 million years, bacteria had evolved the capacity for photosynthesis, something like those time frames. So this all-important reaction, one of the most important biological reactions on Earth, photosynthesis, was invented by cyanobacteria. They were the ones that were able to capture carbon dioxide and water from their environment, capture sunlight as an energy source to split water molecules, and make high-energy molecules that then could construct glucose from carbon dioxide and the hydrogens from water. That chemistry released oxygen into the air. So photosynthesis allowed the organisms to harness a new kind of energy, light, in order to power chemistry, the chemistry of making their own food, as it were. In the process, lots of oxygen was released into the atmosphere. So we have then some 3.5 billion years of a chemical process that was liberating oxygen into the atmosphere. So today, planet Earth has high levels of oxygen because for a long, long time on Earth, organisms have been releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. If for some reason photosynthesis suddenly stopped, a lot of the oxygen would disappear out of the atmosphere, as oxygen is a highly reactive molecule and it would react with other molecules on the surface of the Earth. So the fact that we have lots of oxygen in the atmosphere is due to the continuing existence of photosynthetic organisms. And of course, the oxygen in the atmosphere is critical for the life of animals. In fact, animals, large animals, multi-celled animals, they're highly active organisms, so they need lots of oxygen to process energy. They wouldn't even have been possible. They couldn't have evolved until sufficient oxygen was in the atmosphere. So animals owe a debt of gratitude to the long history of photosynthesis on planet Earth. Not only do animals, of course, need the oxygen produced by photosynthesis, but they, of course, ultimately get their energy, their glucose, from plants. So animals either eat plants directly and get glucose that way, or they eat other animals that eat plants. So if we step back and think about our solar system, then, again, we have discovered life on Earth. Whether there was ever life on Mars is an open question. But the life on Earth, all living things that we understand, require an energy source. And we'll be learning that early in the history of life, scientists think that the first living things were using chemical energy on the Earth in the form of molecules. So many scientists think the first living things emerged in these undersea volcanic vents. And we'll study that a little later, but the idea would be the first living things were liberated into the oceans. They already had all of the characteristics on that list of the characteristics of life. They had a genetic machinery, they had proteins, there was a cell membrane, they were doing complex chemistry, metabolism. But where did they get their energy? From the environment, from molecules in the oceans. So the idea is then the first living things, in a sense, had to eat molecules, nutrients in their environment. But then something extraordinary happened. Again, after a few 100 million years of the evolution of different kinds of bacteria, we get the emergence of a new kind of bacteria that could perform this critically important process called photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria emerge. They capture sunlight energy, and that is the energy to power photosynthesis using carbon dioxide and water to make glucose and liberating oxygen. So in other words, if we think about it from the point of view of the solar system, living things on Earth, they were able to tap into a giant source of energy, the sun. Very cool trick. So again, early life on Earth was consuming nutrients in the environments of those living cells in the oceans, but then a new kind of bacteria evolved, that could tap into this giant ball of energy that we call our sun. So the sunlight that had been bombarding the planet since the origin of the Earth was now a source of energy to power ecosystems on the Earth. And we can kind of see sort of how clever this kind of trick is of these photosynthetic organisms by considering this object right here. This is a sort of a thing you can buy like on the internet. It is a glass container filled with water, and in the water is algae. You can see little bits of algae here, and then these little tiny shrimps. Now this is a totally enclosed chamber, so nothing can get in or out except for sunlight, right? And the idea here is then this chamber, provided it gets enough sunlight, this ecosystem can survive for several years. What happens then, of course, is the algae, photosynthetic organism, is going to capture that sunlight and use dissolved carbon dioxide in the water and water itself to make glucose, releasing oxygen into the water. Well, the animals here then are going to be feeding on the algae and, of course, using the oxygen to burn the glucose to power their cells. In the process, they release carbon dioxide back out into the water, a very starting material for photosynthesis. So what you have here is a self-contained ecosystem powered by sunlight. Well, the same is true today on the Earth. So with the evolution of cyanobacteria and photosynthetic organisms being the base of most food chains, we've got a planetary system where life today, most of life today, is dependent upon the input of this energy, solar energy. That's what's driving photosynthesis, and then the photosynthetic organisms are the base of most food chains. So if we think about then other intelligent living things in our galaxy, one wonders whether there could be other intelligent living things without some kind of process like photosynthesis having evolved on that planet. Because again, if these organisms are large and they're active like animals on Earth, they would have needed some kind of energy source, right, to get that big. And so it raises the question whether something similar to photosynthesis may have evolved on other planets, allowing these kinds of creatures, animal-like creatures, intelligent creatures, to evolve. It is currently unknown, of course, whether there are any other intelligent creatures in the galaxy, but given our Earth's history and the significance of photosynthesis in the evolution of large animals, complex, intelligent creatures, it would be fascinating to study the conditions that gave rise to intelligent organisms elsewhere in our galaxy. Of course, today, NASA and other groups are putting up satellites to detect other planets around other stars. And one common technique is to measure the slight drop in starlight from a star as a planet crosses, so as it transits in its orbit. Some of the starlight will be blocked for a little while, and sensitive cameras can pick that up. Here's an example of our sun here, and that little spot is Mercury. So some months ago, Mercury was transiting between us and the sun, and here that little spot is Mercury. Well, there's another generation of telescopes going to be put up into space, the James Webb Space Telescope, and it's larger than the Hubble Space Telescope, so not only can it see sort of farther out into space, but it can also do some other interesting types of missions. So, for example, one thing scientists are thinking about is using the James Webb Telescope to visualize planets directly. Well, what they would do is put up this kind of solar shield here to block the light from the star itself, but the planet that's orbiting that star would be visible by the James Webb Telescope. So it would be directly trying to make an observation of a planet. Of course, this planet could be seen because of the reflected light from its own star. Currently, it's difficult to actually visualize the planets. They are just overwhelmed by the brightness of their own star. But the idea is to block the star's light and then observe the planet directly. But also, one of the interesting things you can do then with these new next generation telescopes is you can begin to study the atmospheres of planets. So as a planet does transit in front of a star, some of the starlight moves through the atmosphere. And the molecules that are in the atmosphere, they absorb certain wavelengths of light. And different molecules absorb a unique set of wavelengths. So it's kind of like a chemical signature. If you can figure out what wavelengths of light are being absorbed, you can kind of reconstruct what molecules must be present in the atmosphere. And so this then gives scientists a way to characterize the atmospheres of exoplanets using the next generation James Webb Telescope. So, for example, on our planet, there are high levels of oxygen. And so if we found another exoplanet with high levels of oxygen, scientists would be very interested to study that planet in more detail. Because there, again, oxygen being highly reactive, it suggests that there's something that continues to put oxygen into the planet's atmosphere. Otherwise, it would dissipate as it reacts with other things on the planet. So high levels of oxygen might be considered a biosignature. There might be living things on some exoplanet that are producing oxygen, just as photosynthetic organisms on Earth do the same. In addition, we've learned when measuring carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere, we see that sort of seasonal oscillation in the levels of CO2. And we explain this. So, for example, in the spring, photosynthetic organisms are doing photosynthesis. They're capturing carbon dioxide. And so we see the downward part of the graph here. So as CO2 gets sucked out of the atmosphere, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere drops. Well, this is occurring in chloroplasts. If you're a complex thing, or cyanobacteria are just doing it within their cellular compartment. But nevertheless, in the springtime, when we get a lot of growth of photosynthetic organisms, you see a drop in CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Well, then in the fall, as, for example, many leaves and things die, microorganisms will digest them, decompose them, and burn the sugar and release CO2 back into the atmosphere. This would occur in mitochondria if it's a complex cell. And so the idea is we get the seasonal fluctuation. Well, that too could be an interesting thing to find on an exoplanet. Are there fluctuations? Are there oscillations in the chemistry in the atmosphere? If so, it might indicate that there are some living processes going on, chemical reactions going on that are a signature of living things on the planet. So it is an exciting time in astrobiology. There's folks who are studying the conditions for life in our galaxy and whether other living things are present on exoplanets or circling other stars. But again, one wonders, given our evolutionary history, and again, intelligence would not have evolved were it not for this process of photosynthesis. One wonders whether other life forms around the galaxy were able to tap into the energy of their own star, and so power complex chemistry and sort of populate the planets with all kinds of diverse living things, some of which perhaps then evolved greater and greater intelligence.